What is up, fellow writers, gentlefolk, scoundrels, and snails? This is Jane from Story Kitchen, and this is part 2, the Absolute Beginner's Guide for Writing SFF. Part 2 of this guide picks up where part 1 left off. So the thing that sets SFF or speculative fiction apart from the other genres in general is the speculative element, or the fantastical element, or what is the thing that is different in your story world versus in your real life. So that's the first thing that I want to pay a little bit of attention to, since that is the thing that is really going to distinguish this genre from others. What is the speculative element in your story? How are you using it? How are you introducing it? How is the reader made aware of what's going on? So the first thing to think about when you start writing is, what is the speculative element that I'm using? That is probably going to come naturally to you. You might not even have to ask yourself that. It's going to come out through the story. You might just start writing it. This question, though, it seems obvious on the surface, but it's actually a little bit trickier. In some cases, this question can be really simple. For example, you are writing about life on a spaceship. Well, the spaceship part is speculative because that doesn't exist in our world yet, as far as we know. You might be writing about the future. Again, that's speculative, probably sci-fi. Or maybe the world of your story is exactly like our lived world, except that there are vampires and werewolves. That's the speculative element, because as far as we know, vampires and werewolves don't exist in our reality, I hope. Or maybe you're writing an alternate history, like what happens if Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo? What would history look like? How would events unfold? That's also speculative. But other times, this question of what is speculative or what is the speculative element can be a little bit trickier. For example, maybe spirits are real in your lived reality, and they're also in your fiction. Is that speculative? Or are you merely reflecting your lived reality? I'll give you an example. So I grew up in Japan with a lot of Japanese relatives, and what Westerners would maybe call superstitions are very much alive and just part of daily practice. Like, people straight up believe in ghosts. You know, I grew up believing in ghosts. My family believes in ghosts. We believe in spirit possession. We believe that spirits are everywhere. It's part of Shinto. It's also kind of part of Buddhism, because in Japan, Shinto, that's a whole other topic. So for example, when I got sick one time, my grandma was like, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take a rock, and I'm gonna chant some prayers, and we're gonna rub that rock over your chest and belly, and that is gonna draw the sickness out. That was a spiritual practice and a belief that she had, and that she taught me and my mom, that maybe in a fiction story would be considered speculative element, but it is part of my lived reality. Does that make sense at all? I would personally still call those stories that deal with stuff like that speculative fiction. But you can see how the line can get a little bit blurred there. There are no easy answers to this, but I love genre bending and blurred lines and boundaries that wiggle around and don't make sense. So go ahead and write whatever you're gonna write, and worry about genre classification later. In the beginning, just write the story the way that you want to write it, with the elements that you want to write it. The other thing that makes what is the speculative element question a little bit tricky is that there are some subgenres of SFF that don't have speculative elements in the sense of something that is different from our lived reality. For example, horror doesn't always have to have a speculative element, and yet horror is considered part of speculative fiction. But sometimes the horror can be a very real thing. It can be explained away by science or by just a horrible person who's doing horrible things. I think the reason that horror still falls under speculative is because the mood and the atmosphere and the expressiveness, the emotional expressiveness of horror gets dialed way, way up beyond sort of what is typical in our lived realities. But again, this is a tricky question, right? So once you've sort of thought about, or you have your speculative element and you're working with it, another thing to consider as you write, or after you've finished your first short story, is how integrated is that speculative element in your story, in your characters' reactions, in the plot overall. There are some people who will say, well, if the speculative element is not integrated in the story, then it's not really SFF. One thing I've heard some writers say is, if you can take out the speculative element of the story and the story can still work the way it was written, then it's not an SFF story. I think that's bullshit. Okay, I don't care. If your story takes place on a spaceship, that's speculative. Whether or not you could remove the fact that it takes place on a spaceship and maybe replace it with like an ocean liner or cruise ship or something, and you could say, well, the story doesn't change at all. I don't care. It's still on a spaceship. That's still speculative to me. But again, I tend to have very, very broad umbrella ideas about what speculative fiction is because I find that more useful than trying to draw narrow boundaries. That's just me. There are a couple different ways that speculative elements can be deployed. And this is something that I learned from Ted Chiang, and I'll link to a Ted Chiang interview where he talks about this a little bit. But basically, he sort of sees it's on a spectrum of, on the one hand, you have stories that are thought experiments. What if this one thing were different? Let's extrapolate out from there and see what happens. The other modality is using the speculative element as a metaphor. So for example, ghosts can be a metaphor for being haunted by a real event, for PTSD, for a memory that you can't shake. Ghosts can be a metaphor for guilt. That doesn't mean that the ghost isn't real in the story. It is real in the story, but thematically, it's there to highlight something else, right? So that it forces us to think about something else besides the ghost as just a literal ghost. It is packed with many layers of meaning. A lot of stories fall in between or include elements of both of these things, both thought experiment-ish plus the speculative element as metaphor and theme. I think it can be useful to, once you've written your story, again, I don't think this is a great tool for generating the story, but once you've written a story or once you're sort of halfway there, I like to think about this question. What's the point of the speculative element for me? Why am I including it? Is this more sort of on the thought experiment side, or more I'm trying to say something metaphorical or thematic or express some feeling with my speculative element? And that can help you highlight some of the themes and brainstorm plot points that are going to support what you want to do with your speculative element, if that makes sense. So it can be a great aid to structuring the rest of your story. As I mentioned last time, I'm really bad at endings, so this is one of the things I do to try to get to an ending, is what is the ending that's going to reinforce the way that I'm using my speculative element. Last time I touched on this genre conversation, and I want to get back to it now, because now that we're talking about what makes something specifically SFF and how is that different, now you want to start thinking about what are the genre expectations. Because to me, the best way to understand genre is to think about, instead of saying what genre am I writing in and what elements, what characteristics and elements do I have that I share with these other genres, to me that's never been a super useful method of taxonomy, but it's more like, what am I inspired by? What other stories is my story in conversation with and responding to? And those can be multiple genres, right? Like you could be inspired by a horror story and a Disney story and write something that's sort of taking on tropes from both. So it can be in conversation with two very different genres. And that's okay. That's why I like this conversation framework for thinking about genre better than what elements does it have, what characteristics, how can we define it. The reason that you want to start thinking about what other stories is my story in conversation with and what genres are those stories in, so that I can start thinking about it, is because this is where you want to start thinking about your reader expectations. If you are writing a hardcore military sci-fi, there's a certain audience for that hardcore military sci-fi story, and they will have certain expectations, and you can either deliver those expectations or subvert them, or both. I think both is the best, when you deliver some and subvert some in fun, new, surprising ways, and people go, oh, I haven't seen that before, that's cool. But you also want to deliver on some of those expectations, because that's why those readers are coming to you to read your book, right? They want something out of it. This is true of all genres. So figure out what is the thing. And for SFF, often it's things like they want to be part of this cool, interesting world. They want to be part of a wondrous future. They want to be chilled to the bone in your scary gothic atmosphere. Once you start dialing in on what are the reader expectations, what is the reader coming to my story for, how can I deliver, how can I subvert, how can I make use of certain tropes that they're familiar with, and how can I play and twist those tropes, that's when you can really start expanding on your basic story and your basic plot and include these elements that are going to really make your story come alive and make the reader really respond to your story. Reader expectations are also especially important to think about in the beginning of your story or your novel, because the reader is going to come to your story or your novel with very little understanding at first of what it is. Either they will pick your story online or in a magazine and just start reading it, and they'll only have the title pretty much. And especially if you're a new writer, right? If you're Stephen King, people see Stephen King and they kind of are like, I have a feeling I know what this story is going to be or what I can expect from it. But if you're a brand new writer, you don't have much out there that's published. If you're a new writer, then it's even more important to set the genre expectations and the reader expectations fairly quickly. This is going to be a story about this. This is what's real in the world and this is what's not. And this is where using pretty prose and metaphors can, for SFF, be a detriment. So for example, what if I started a story with this sentence? The trees reach their leafless branches up towards the bare winter sky. Now, as a first sentence, if that were a romance novel, people would understand that the word reached is a metaphor. The trees aren't literally stretching up and moving and reaching. But if I'm writing an SFF story and I'm published in an SFF market, then readers are going to be a little bit, oh, does she mean reach? Like these alien trees are actually like ants and they're actually reading? They may or may not. Some readers will and some won't. So you want to try to avoid those kinds of things at the beginning of your story in order to situate your reader firmly in what is real and what is not. Now this sentence would be perfectly fine if in the next sentence I said something like, the trees lumbered towards the marsh on their huge tree trunk legs. Okay, that's a terrible sentence, but you know what I mean. And then the reader immediately goes, oh, so they were literally reaching. Or maybe the next sentence is going to not have the trees in it at all, and it'll be clear that that was just a metaphor and the trees aren't really moving. One of the things that I hear from editors all the time when they are talking about SFF stories, and especially for, again, new writers where you don't have a name established, is introduce the speculative element early. And I think that's partly because, again, that's what the reader is coming to your story for. They want to know what's cool, what's different about your story world versus our lived realities. What is the promise of this story world? For new writers, introducing that speculative element really early will not only help ground the reader, but it'll also give them a little spark of excitement that will make them feel hooked and want to keep reading. So I think that's also really important. Again, this is more of a guideline than a rule, but trying to put it into the first sentence, the first paragraph, is, I think, in general, a good idea, and especially for short stories. For a novel, you have a little bit more time, and also novels have a little more packaging around them to help the reader get situated. You have a back cover blurb, you've got the cover art, you've got a little bit of marketing buzz, you may have the review on Amazon. The reader often has just a little more context for understanding what the novel is, but for a short story, there's often nothing but the title. Make the title help you do the work of introducing the speculative element and introduce it early. The other reason that you want to introduce the speculative element early is I'm a big believer in this principle of let your reader build and not demolish. In other words, you want to introduce bricks of understanding for the reader, bricks of your story, so that the reader can build on what they already know instead of getting a false idea and then having to go back, dismantle, and rebuild. I will talk about some exceptions to that. Obviously, if you're writing a story, an SFF story that has a mystery element, you want to include a red herring, then you actually want the reader to have some misconception. Or if you're setting up for a big twist or reveal or a surprise, then you want the reader to have some misconception that they're building on, that then they go, oh, everything I thought was wrong. Ah, great surprise. But that is a very intentional thing, and that is a very intentionally misdirecting the reader kind of exercise. But all too often I've seen situations in stories by writers where the reader makes assumptions about the way the world is or the way the character is, only to have that assumption challenged or reversed as they read along, and they have to sort of go back and undo what they thought. And that just creates a little more work for the reader, especially when it's unnecessary. So, for example, I'm writing a story about a coven of witches who are trying to summon the spirit of a long-dead sorceress, and this is set at an all-women's college in the northeast of the United States in the year 1878. So let's say that my first scene is this really wonderful conversation between two friends as they walk between buildings during classes. It may be a wonderful scene, but I would wonder whether there was enough there for me to explain that this is 1878 and that these two friends are actually witches and not just classmates. Because when somebody reads about two women talking about walking from one classroom to the other, they're immediately going to assume that this is contemporary and that there is no speculative element, because those are the things that are closest to our understanding of our realities right now, right? We live in contemporary times and there are no witches in the sense of my story. You want to understand what is the reader going to assume and make sure you put in sufficient clues. So maybe I can use language that feels more old-fashioned. So immediately I'm cueing my reader into thinking, oh, maybe these aren't contemporary college students because they're talking a little bit funny. And maybe they could be talking about classes, but also about when they're going to meet up to do the summoning ritual. Then the reader's like, oh, these aren't just regular college students, there's something else going on. That wasn't a great example, but do you know what I mean? So try to pick an opening scene that will help you showcase the elements about your story that are maybe not what the reader would assume at first glance, instead of picking a rather generic scene to open with where the reader might just make a whole bunch of assumptions that you don't want them to make at that stage. Because once they make assumptions, it takes more time to kind of undo those assumptions. I will use a really good example about race of characters. A lot of us know that if the character is not coded at all, then a lot of readers will default assume that the character is white. That's fine. But then when later on, let's say halfway through the story, you drop something in there to indicate that the character is, let's say, Asian. A lot of my characters are Asian because that's what I write. Then the reader is going to sometimes even miss that. They will continue to assume that the character is default white throughout, because they're not in a space where they're still building that character, right? Halfway through the story, they've already built the character in their mind and it's somewhat fixed. So it's going to be a lot harder for them to undo what they fixed, if that makes sense. So you want to set some of those up early. That said, I don't think you need physical descriptions all the time to denote stuff like that, to denote the character's identity. You can do it in lots of other ways. And that's more of a general writing topic, so I won't get into. But in terms of speculative fiction, that example was about race, but you could just as easily say it could be about the speculative element. If your character is a magic user in a world where magic users are rare or common or whatever, you want to drop that in pretty early, because the reader's default assumption is going to be that they're not a magic user. And they may be surprised and feel tricked, or might even miss it if your magic use is really subtle. That said, I think it's totally possible to hide things and reveal them to the reader at the right moment. And that is a deliberate, intentional technique. So I included some examples of what I consider really interesting openings to study. So let's look at one of these now. One is from Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House, a famous opening. It does such a good job of opening this story, so I'm going to read it. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly. I think that's supposed to be neatly. Bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. Okay, I love this opening because it does so much, right? It starts with this declarative sentence that kind of tells you what the story is going to be about. No live organism can continue for long to exist under conditions of absolute reality. Okay, so we have live organism, which to me suggests that the house is a live organism. Because later it says, Hill House, not sane, stands, blah, blah, blah. Hill House is the protagonist, is the subject of the sentence and is kind of the protagonist of this paragraph right here. Can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. So there's something in this story about sanity and absolute reality and the tension between the two. And then it just goes on with this awesome description of the house. And you know that you are in for a classic haunted house story of this house that may or may not be sane and may or may not have conditions of absolute reality. So that's great. All right, the next example is, I think, a little more subtle, but also very effective in my opinion. And this is a short story by Rivers Solomon called Blood is Another Word for Hunger. First of all, awesome title, right? Titles can do so much for your short stories. Don't neglect your titles if you're writing short stories. Your title is not just the thing that's going to draw in the reader, but it's also the thing that can help the reader get situated right away. It's like the story starts with the title, not with the first line. It starts with the title. So here's the first paragraph of Blood is Another Word for Hunger. In a wooden house on a modest farmstead by a dense wood near a roving river to the west of town, miles from the wide road and far away from the peculiar madness that is men at war, lived the Mrs. grown daughters Adelaide and Catherine, the Mrs. sister Bitsy, the Mrs. poorly mother Anna, and the Mrs. 15-year-old slave girl Sully, who had a heart made of teeth. For as soon as she heard word that Albert, the Mrs.'s husband, had been slain in battle, she took up arms against the family who'd raised her, slipping a tincture of valerian root and skullcap into their cups of warmed milk before slitting their throats in the night. Whoa! What I love about this, first of all, it's one long sentence, which a lot of writing advice will tell you, don't write long, complicated sentences, but it works because there is a rhythm and a cadence and a poetry to it, right? There's the listing of the inhabitants of the house, the Mrs. grown daughters, right? Now, this is a really interesting example because it does a thing that I just told you to avoid doing, which again goes to show that none of this is a hard and fast rule. You can do whatever you want. But here, Rivers has written the slave girl Sully, who had a heart made of teeth. And when I first read that line, I thought, is this an actual literal thing? Her heart is actually made of teeth? But then as I kept reading, I was like, oh no, this is a metaphor for how she feels, for what's going on with her internally. The other thing that I love about this is like, this paragraph could be the end of a story. How did Sully get to this point where she is murdering this family? And I love that. And I love that that is where the story begins, with what some writers would consider the climax of a story. Rivers starts the story with this climactic moment. And it is such a visual, visceral, gripping moment that I think it can't help but draw you in. As I mentioned before about Ted Chiang and his thinking about the speculative element, I just want to read a quote by Ted because I think it encapsulates what I was trying to say And I'll leave the link to the podcast link where he is interviewed and talks about this on the podcast, because he talks about a lot of other stuff that I thought was interesting. So Ted Chiang says, so when it comes to fiction about the speculative or the fantastic, one way to think about these kinds of stories is to ask, are they interested in the speculative element literally or metaphorically or both? For example, at one end of the spectrum, you've got Kafka, and in the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa turning into an insect. That is pretty much entirely a metaphor. It's a stand-in for alienation. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got someone like Kim Stanley Robinson, and when he writes about terraforming Mars, Mars is not standing in for anything else. He is writing very literally about Mars. There you go. A little way to think about what is the speculative element doing in your fiction. My last tip for you is about cognitive load on the reader. And I touched on this, I didn't call it cognitive load, but I touched on this earlier when I was talking about making your reader dismantle something based on their assumptions versus letting them build off of what they already know about your story and continue to build. And to me, that is an element of cognitive load. Basically, I use the term cognitive load on the reader to mean, what work am I asking the reader to do in order to stay in my story? Whether it's to stay immersed in my story or to understand my story, or both. They're not always the same thing. You can be immersed in something that you don't fully understand yet, right? And you can understand something that you don't feel immersed in. But most readers want either to be fully immersed or to understand, or often they want both. So cognitive load is my term for the work that you're expecting the reader to do. All the information you're expecting the reader to hold in their heads as they read, and to remember and to put together and to piece together. All texts ask something of their readers. No text is 100% transparent and effortless, but some texts ask for more than others, and this is a matter of degree, and it's also a matter of preference. Some readers love to have a lot of cognitive load on them. They love to be challenged. They love to treat the text as sort of a puzzle or an excavation exercise where they're sort of discerning the subtle meanings out of the seeds that you're dropping, the hints and clues that you're giving them. They're piecing together the puzzle. They feel very active. They feel very engaged. To them, that is the joy of reading. Oh, and by the way, the same person can have both, right? So let's pretend there's just one reader. So sometimes I like to do that with a text, and I find that really exciting and engaging. Other times, you know what? I just want to take a warm bath in the words and just let them wash over me and do almost no work at all and just be completely led by the hand and fed grapes and just love and enjoy and be immersed and be comforted. Those are two different experiences. On the one hand, the first example is asking me to do a lot of cognitive load, a lot of engaging with the text and thinking, and sometimes that's okay and I'm in the mood for that. Now, other times I'm in the mood for a story that asks a lot less of me, that does not burden me with a lot of cognitive load. So for me, it depends on what mood I'm in, and different readers will have different preferences. So I bring this up just so that you start paying attention to what kind of writer you are, and you may be different writers at different times too. So what kind of story is the story that you're telling? Where are the areas that you're asking a lot of the reader, and where are the areas where you're just kind of like giving them what they want and letting them just enjoy, taste all the flavors that you're delivering to them? Let's turn as an example to another story. This one is by Sarah Pinsker, and it is The Court Magician. And the first line of this story is this: "The boy who will become court magician this time is not a cruel child." All right, it's a very simple sentence, but it carries a lot of weight, and there's actually a lot going on here. We know that this world that the story is set in has something like a court, because there's a reference to court magician. That indicates some sort of monarchy. We know that the court has a magician, which suggests that there's magic in the world. Also, there's a play of time, where in the present tense, the boy is not a cruel child, right? That's present tense. But there's a flash forward to the future when the boy will become court magician, the boy who will become the court magician. So we've got a narrator who is in the present but is aware of a future event. which is really, really interesting. The phrase "this time" also implies that this is an event that has happened before and maybe repeats. Maybe there's been a string of court magicians. That's the implication. It further implies that these court magicians are discovered or perhaps trained as children. And then on top of that, so that's all like this world building stuff and this time stuff, all in this small short sentence. But then there's this assertion, he's not a cruel child. And that makes us wonder, but why are you insisting that he's not a cruel child? Do we expect him to be cruel? Does the narrator expect him to be cruel? Has he done something that could be interpreted as cruel that the narrator is trying to argue is not a sign that he's cruel? Do you know what I mean? So there's something there that we don't quite know enough about yet, but it's something that catches our attention and says, hey, let's pay attention to this. This is going to be important. So already we have a bunch of world building in this sentence. We suspect that the story is going to engage with this question of, is the boy cruel or not? What is cruelty? That's sort of what I take away from this, is that's going to be one of the themes that the story engages with. So there's a lot packed into 14 words here. But the genius of this, and this is why Sarah Pinsker is an amazing writer, none of it feels overwhelming. It's a very readable sentence. There's a lot going on, but we almost don't even notice the cognitive load that it's being placed on us. So there is a lot you can do with your sentences without making the reader feel burdened or confused or lost or at sea. When I read that sentence, I certainly don't feel any of those things personally. I feel like, okay, I get it. And it's partly because of the delivery of the information. The boy, she starts with the boy. Okay, we know what a boy is, so that's not hard. Who will become court magician? Okay, court magician, that is a very legible phrase because we have other reference points. We know what a court is and we know what a magician is, so we can imagine what a court magician is. This time, okay, that's interesting, but we can understand that this has happened before, is not a cruel child. Again, each of these components is very understandable, it's very legible, it is easy to understand, but together they suggest a very complex picture. So to contrast a good example by Sarah Pinsker, I made up a bad example by Jane Pinkard, another opening sentence that I made up for this story. The boy Alphonse, the future court magician for the regent of Ilaria, learned his trade from great Greta. Okay, so we still have the boy and the court and the magician, but we also now have a bunch of names. Alphonse, the regent, Ilaria, great Greta. That's a lot of proper names for the reader to keep in their head. And the problem is the reader doesn't know which are the important names yet. Is Alphonse the hero of the story, or is great Greta the hero of the story? We don't know yet. Who is the regent? Why is the regent named? Is the regent going to be a main character in this story? We don't know yet. To me, sentences like that create more confusion than they illuminate. Sometimes I think we are tempted to pack a lot in because we're told that we want to ground the reader at the very beginning of the work. And that's true. I've said that. I think we do. But there are ways to do it that don't involve stuffing a bunch of information, right? Sarah Pinsker didn't give us a lot of information or data. She just allowed a simple sentence to suggest a lot about the world and the theme. And also she gave us two characters. Really one character, the boy, but there's an implicit narrator character there who is able to seemingly see into the future. And then finally, what's really missing in the second bad example is what I consider the hook of the whole story, right? Did you notice? The assertion that the boy is not cruel is missing. In Sarah Pinsker's version, the good version, the excellent version, that's the thing that makes us keep reading. Why are we told that he's not cruel? What's going to happen? Why would we think he is cruel? Why is that important? In the second sentence, it's just a bunch of names, and we're like, why should we care? We don't care. I don't care. I don't really want to know about Alphonse personally, who learned his trade from great Greta. There's really nothing there that explicitly hooks me. So learn to be harsh with your own writing like that, And ask yourself, what is the thing that will keep the reader reading? What is the hook? And the hook can be your speculative element or related to your speculative element. It could be, oh, this is going to be really cool because of this cool speculative element, fantastical thing that I want to read more about. But it could also be something as subtle as Sarah Pinsker's The Boy Is Not Cruel. And that is it for now. Have a beautiful day, writer friends. Happy writing.